Our first speaker is Dr. Heather Murphy. Heather has over 10 years' experience working in the area of water and health in Canada and abroad. She obtained her PhD in environmental engineering from the University of Guelph, Canada, where she focused on appropriate water treatment technologies for developing countries. Following her PhD, she worked for 2 years with the United Nations International Emergency Children's Fund, UNICEF, as a water, sanitation, and hygiene specialist in Mali and Madagascar. She recently completed a postdoctoral fellowship with the Public Health Agency of Canada, where she focused on determining the burden of waterborne disease on the Canadian population. She is presently a research fellow at the University of Guelph, where she is conducting research on the challenges of water provision in Canadian First Nations communities. In July 2015, Heather will join the College of Public Health at Temple University in Philadelphia as an assistant professor in environmental health. Heather's research interests involve understanding and addressing water and health challenges in both developed and developing countries. And I'd like to welcome Heather to the floor.
This is a map of the world showing the sanitation targets. So right now, according to this monitoring program, 2.5 billion people do not have access to improved sanitation, and 1 billion defecate in the open. And what do I mean by improved sanitation? Well, sanitation is a latrine or a way to separate excreta from humans in a sanitary manner. So what was MDG number 7C? Well, it was half by 2015 the proportion of the population without sustainable access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation. And where are we with respect to meeting that target? Well, the orange here is showing all the countries that are not on track to meeting that target. They're predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa, as you can see. There's 45 that are still not on track. Although we report that in 2010 we did meet the goal for water provision worldwide, I would argue it's very inequitable, and that an improved water source isn't always a safe source. So the amount of people in the world that still do not have access to safe drinking water is significantly higher than that 700 million that I presented. For sanitation, we're not on track to meet the MDG. You can see the countries in orange again are those countries not on track. There's 69 in the world that are not on track, and 37 of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. So I'm just going to spend a few slides just showing some pictures from places that I've worked that I think help illustrate the challenges with the related to water and sanitation provision. So this is in Antananarivo, Madagascar, the capital, in a slum community. This is an open sewer environment, and then right next to it is a clean water point, I guess, of piped water. People don't have piped water supplies to their home, so they wait in line for water and pay per jerry can of these water containers you can see here. And the water is sporadic and it comes on only certain times of the day. These jerry cans are going to be important for later on in my presentation. This is a picture from a slum community in Chennai in India. This is another water provision, which would be considered an improved water source, but I would argue it's not really improved, even though it's piped to the community. It is running through this, I don't know what you would call it, a dirty stream that's extremely contaminated. People openly defecate, garbage is in there. And this would not be considered an improved source of drinking water, in my opinion. In rural Vietnam, this water is actually black. And I was shocked at the quality of water. Now, households generally wouldn't be drinking this water, but they would be using it for bathing and other things like laundry. Now, rural Mali brings its own challenges. There's not a lot of water at all, and people have to travel many kilometers a day to fetch water. It's often children, girls, and women who go and collect water for their families and also to bathe or do laundry. And then lastly, in rural Cambodia, water is quite abundant, particularly in the rainy season, but you can see that this community here, the village that I lived in, often flooded, and homes who could afford it would raise their homes up off the ground. But these floodwaters were often used for drinking, for cooking, children are bathing in them, but their animals were located in the exact same environment, so there was both human and animal excreta in those water sources. And then lastly, there's open defecation, which is commonplace in a lot of these countries. So I argue that a lack of water and sanitation undermines the achievement of other Millennium Goals. Particularly if we're going to talk about the MDGs, eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. We can't eradicate that without addressing water and sanitation. We can't achieve universal primary education. We cannot promote gender equality and empower women. We cannot reduce child mortality, and we cannot improve maternal health. And I'm going to explain to you why. So first we got to talk about the consequences of inadequate safe water and sanitation. What are they? Well, diarrhea is the number one. Diarrhea remains the second leading cause of death in children under 5, killing 4,000 children every day, more than AIDS, malaria, and measles combined. And 88% of these diarrheal deaths are attributable to unsafe water, inadequate sanitation, and poor hygiene. So we were talking this morning about child mortality rates and how they're all in sub-Saharan Africa. Well, the WASH rates are also horrible in sub-Saharan Africa. So really, how are we going to reduce child mortality if we don't also incorporate water and sanitation into some of our development programs? Diarrhea, repeated diarrheal infections are the major underlying cause of child malnutrition, which I'm not sure if a lot of people are aware of. So you can't have a feeding program without also addressing chronic illness in children and chronic diarrhea. Poor nutrition is not only the result of the food insecurity, but high incidence of diarrhea as a result of inadequate access to WASH. So again, how do we eradicate extreme poverty and hunger? How do we achieve primary education when kids are not going to school because they're chronically ill? And how, again, do we reduce child mortality? And on to malnutrition. Chronic and acute malnutrition, low birth weights, and suboptimal breastfeeding cause an estimated 3.5 million deaths of mothers and children annually. 1 of 3 of these children under 5 suffer from stunting due to chronic undernutrition. And stunting is now being more and more related to inadequate water and sanitation, and not just feeding practices under children in the ages 1 to 3. So again, this comes back to reducing child mortality, but also improving maternal health. How are we going to improve mothers' health if they don't have access to sanitation and hygiene and appropriate water supply? So all of these things result in lost productivity. When we talk about stunting, it's the result of poor development in early childhood. And for people who aren't familiar with stunting, it is low height for age. And that damage is irreversible, and it's done by the age of 3. And as a result, when children are stunted, there's deficits in cognition and school achievement. So 1 in 3 children is never going to develop the way you or I because they were stunted in their early years of life. In Madagascar, the problem was 50% of children were chronically stunted. So 50% of that population is not going to be productive in the same way as you or I. 443 million school days are lost every year due to water and sanitation related diseases. And women and girls often travel over 30 minutes to collect water. So how do we eradicate extreme poverty and hunger when women and girls are not being educated, they're not in the workforce, they're not being productive? That's 50% of our population. How are we going to achieve universal primary education when these girls aren't going to school and when kids in general are chronically ill from diarrheal illnesses? And then how are we going to promote gender equality and empower women? So on to gender equality a bit more specifically. Girls do not attend school often because of water collection duties. They're also more likely to drop out of school because of a lack of sanitation facilities. So frequently schools in countries I've worked in, they construct a school, but there's no water point, there's no latrines. And so girls, when they reach menstruating age, they are not going to go to school. Girls and women are vulnerable to sexual abuse in informal settlements and emergency camps, but also in their own communities. If there are no latrines used, women will defecate at night in the dark, and they're vulnerable to sexual abuse. So again, achieving universal primary education, how are we going to do that? Improve maternal health and promote gender equality and empower women. So I'm going to talk to you about some solutions, some programs that I've seen work on the ground with my experience with UNICEF, common water and sanitation interventions, and I'll give you a bit of the health impact that has been studied by different academic institutions on these interventions. So the first, it's not very profound, but it's hand washing with soap. Hand washing with soap has shown to reduce diarrheal disease by between 42 and 47%. But there's a huge behavior change process to convince people to wash hands with soap. It's not challenging, it's not a difficult technology, but the behavior change aspect is extremely challenging. When I worked in Mali, the Ministry of Health, I used to visit all the time and work with them, they did not have soap in their washrooms. If the Ministry of Health doesn't have soap in their washrooms, well, how are you going to expect soap in a rural area? Hand washing rates were 7% in that country. So just addressing hand washing alone, just doing hand washing campaigns, you could have an extremely high health impact. Another one is household water treatment. So this brings me back to those jerry cans that you saw. A lot of people get their water from an improved water source. So say that a source is actually safe. By the time they transport that water to their home, it often becomes contaminated, or when they're storing it in their home, it is no longer safe. So there's all these different technologies out there that can work at a household level to treat water or keep it safe, at least in a safe manner. And these technologies have shown to reduce between 22 and 84% of diarrheal disease in children under the age of 5. Now, there's no one technology that fits any one context, and there's numerous technologies to choose from. And again, it's not really the technology, it's more the behavior change and the importance of needing to treat water or protect water that I find very important. But that these are commonly implemented in the field, and there has been some success. Another intervention that I find extremely effective, and I don't have time to go into it today in detail, but it's called community-led total sanitation. And for some of you that are not familiar with it, it's a powerful behavior change methodology that helps to eliminate open defecation. So there's a triggering process that is facilitated in the community, and Plan International is really the champion, and we have somebody from Plan here today, on CLTS. But really, in my experience, it's the only process I've seen where people sustainably use latrines. I've visited countless schools and communities where latrines are not in use, but when this process has been in place, I've seen sustainable long-term change in terms of reducing open defecation. So communities go through this triggering process and construct their own latrines. And there was a recent impact study done when I was in Mali looking at the health benefits of this intervention, because we really didn't know what the health benefits were. We suspected that they were there. But the study was done by the PEP network, which was a group of 3 universities, the University of Laval, Stanford, and Universidad Nacional de La Plata from Argentina. The Gates Foundation funded this, and it was implemented in Mali when I was there. And so some of the study findings was that there was a clear reduction in loose, watery stools and respiratory illnesses between the 2 different communities that were it was implemented in multiple communities, but when they compared the non-CLTS versus the CLTS communities, these were the findings. So children under 5 were taller than non-CLTS children and 13% less likely to be stunted. There was a 55% reduction in diarrheal disease in children under 5, and there were fewer child diarrheal deaths. The last one I want to talk to you about briefly is wash in schools. I was involved with a large water and sanitation project in schools in Mali, the largest of its kind in the world. We implemented in 900 schools with 5 implementing partners. And this was a massive undertaking. And so a large portion of it was infrastructure, because Mali lacked infrastructure. So we constructed water points, sex-segregated latrines, hygiene kits, and hand-washing stations. But I would argue the infrastructure wasn't the most important part of the intervention. It was really the hygiene education, the strengthening of governance structures at the national level, the kind of municipal level, the school board level, and even at the school level. And ensuring that there was a dedicated budget for WASH at the school level, but also nationally advocating for policy changes so that a school isn't going to be constructed without water points and without latrines. So this impact evaluation just recently was completed by Emory University. The implementing partners were all below, I'll just acknowledge them. And then the impact was that self-reported diarrhea was reduced by 25%, self-reported respiratory infections reduced by 30%, a reduction of 40% of open defecation, 18% increase in observed hand washing with soap, and girls were more likely to wash their hands than boys. And with that, I think I'm on time, and I allow for questions. So.
Thank you very much, Heather, for that very enlightening presentation. Actually, a lot of it just in the beginning seemed like common sense. Before you put your impacts on the bottom there, it just seems like something so natural that when water is not available, water is life. And so it affects everything all the way down. So that was awesome. And I'm opening the floor up to a few questions now for Heather. Yes? Just one moment. I'm going to bring you the fake microphone.
Sorry, thank you. So it's just, if you know, I'm not sure. I thought that the diarrhea was the number one leading cause for children, like under 5, the death of children under 5. I was wondering, did you know the first one?
Pneumonia.
Pneumonia?
Yeah, pneumonia and respiratory illnesses are the number one.
Okay, and like the second one, you said stunting under 3 is irreversible.
Yeah.
So can it possibly happen after 3, or is it?
No, it's restricted to the first early years of life. So it's poor development in utero and then in those first 3 years of life.
Okay, so if you after 3 and you're malnourished, is there any other severe like consequences like that have irreversible causes, or is it usually?
So for stunting particularly, the damage is done in the early years of life, okay. But then there's other malnutrition that causes problems. But I'm not a nutritionist, so I can't get into the details of the different types of malnutrition.
Right.
Like I know the difference between chronic and acute. So if you're looking for something specific on later down the line, if you're chronically ill all the time, well, you're going to be losing weight. You're not for children particularly. They're not as attentive in school. But in terms of the science around it, I'm not so sure.
All right, no problem. Thanks. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was really good.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is great.
Thanks.
I thought you were going to quote my books, but I didn't see you quoting me, but that's okay.
Sorry.
I did a lot with the CDC, Atlanta, Georgia, on water quality intervention at the point of use.
Okay, great.
And this publication, if you Google Philip Makutsa, you'll see a lot of that coming out.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, having said that, I think, this is great. Special comparing with MDGs, I think that's great. The only question I have, and I'm not sure whether it's accurate, may need to go back into your research, is about the stunting that when you did a study on the CLTS study, you mentioned that the children non-SLTC was shorter than where you had the intervention.
Yeah.
But the question is, what was your time frame?
The time frame was...
Because that cannot happen within 6 months, cannot happen within 3 months.
It was over multiple years because I was there in 2012 and I finished in 2014, so it was over 2 years.
Normally that takes a long time. And then the second thing you may need to look at is do what you call a variant analysis. Because attributes or to malnutrition is multiple, it's multidimensional. So you cannot just talk one thing.
Sure. The study results that I reported, it's not my research study, so I'm just taking from the summary report that was provided to me. So I can't comment on the analyses that were done. Those were just the general findings that have been released. So I think there's academic publications coming out. Okay. So in terms of those, that is not my work. I was an implementing partner at the time, so it's not my research. I'm just quoting what was given to me in the summary report.
Okay, thanks, but this is great.
You,
I do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Yes. No, I thought it's a great presentation. Thank you so much. I don't know if people wanted to know a little bit about more how community-led total sanitation work. It's not about families building their own latrines. It's about the triggering process. And the first point is defecate in one place. That's it. It doesn't need to be a latrine. All you need is to dig a hole, defecate in a place. So it's a ladder of behavior change that happens only. So that's just one point. The other thing, I think we put a lot of emphasis on behavior change, but we have learned over the years in WASH, it is the infrastructure. I think we downplay and say people don't know what it is. People know it is important to wash, and people know it is important to have safe water. But what to do when you don't have it? I think it's like blaming the victim. I'm the mother of 5 kids, and I grew up in Bangladesh, and I know we didn't have water. it was hard for me, and my mother is a teacher, my father is an educated person. It's not they're stupid people, it's just you don't have water. And then the water is flooding during the monsoon and the flood. So we grew up with it. So I think there's this emphasis on our behavior change communication. It's important, I'm not denying that, but infrastructure, high tech. So I think we need to get beyond the wash of simple little things. Wash is a very complicated science because you cannot get water in those remote areas unless you have an engineer who knows how to get water out of it. In Bangladesh, where I grew up, you needed to have machines and mechanism to purify water. It's not that simple where I'm a medical doctor and I can just do it. I can't. I need engineers who know this. So I just wanted to make aware of how complex it is. And like right now in Nepal, in a landlocked country, we are struggling to provide water. Where do you get that water? How do you move it? Where do you bring it? I think it's important that we keep on reminding ourselves that development is not that easy. It is a very complex, it needs expertise, it needs time. Exactly. So it is, I just wanted to reinforce that, which I'm sure you are also trying to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, those were great comments. I
were
appreciate
great.
that because in 15 minutes it's hard to get everything across, and it would be great to do a full CLTS presentation because it's a fascinating process. Just on the note of the technology, I wasn't trying to downplay the technology. Being an engineer myself, I just know we have made so many mistakes, and it's not, if I've learned anything, it's not about the technology because it was just that we would have solved the problem 50 years ago, but there's so many more complex things, just like you're saying. And behavior change for me, for sanitation, is one of them, particularly. But then there's, sometimes it's just the water's not available. In Mali, we had to drill wells, and people were like, well, it's such an expensive wash in schools program. Well, it's $20,000 to drill a well in the middle of nowhere. So there is, like, you still do need to make investment, and we still do need that infrastructure. So it's by no means a simple problem.
Great. Thank you very much, Heather. That was great. Good job from the audience. I just wanted to add one thing to what you mentioned about the ripple effects of not having water. You mentioned Nepal, so my organization's projects are in Nepal, and we have girls not going to school because they're fetching water. We have girls not going to school because there are no latrines at school. So then you're looking at child marriage, because when a girl's not educated, she's married off early. You're looking at infant and child mortality. You're looking at human trafficking. So this problem of water, the ripple effects of not having water, and not because you can't figure out how to get it, it's just not there. Mm-hmm. So the problem is a lot deeper. But thank you. That was a great presentation, Heather. Next up is Asha Gervin. Asha is a project management and training specialist with more than 10 years of experience in international development and humanitarian assistance. In managing complex emergency projects, she has worked directly with victims of conflict and natural disaster in Uganda, Indonesia, Ivory Coast, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, and Pakistan. Asha has also been involved in the development of high-level training courses for senior humanitarian managers, working with various organizations in Canada, Spain, and the Netherlands. Asha began teaching part-time in Humber's Postgraduate International Project Management Program in 2012, while working as Associate Director of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders in Canada, and most recently spent 2 months in Indonesia with Humber's Sulawesi Economic Development Strategy Project, SEDS, SEDS. She took over as manager of the International Development Institute in January 2014. Asha holds bachelor's in political science from Trent University, as well as a master's in comparative politics from the London School of Economics. Asha, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm going to apologize in advance for using notes. I have a newborn, so my brain is not what it normally is. But in any case, it's great to be out of the house and engaging with adults again. So today I'm going to be talking about mental health. And when Kent Schroeder first told me about the theme for this symposium, beyond GDP, and he said, you know, what could we do for a health a health panel, my immediate thought went to beyond mortality rates. Having worked for 10 years with Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières, who I'll refer to as MSF for the rest of this presentation, we got used to talking a lot about mortality rates, morbidity rates, access to essential services. But I find that we tend to take a relatively narrow focus. And I saw this both in the humanitarian aid world that I was involved in, but also generally in public health and just around the world. If you think about development in terms of health, we tend to focus on these key indicators. And one thing that I think often gets ignored or left out is mental health. And so I'm going to argue throughout this presentation that it's really impossible to have a clear picture of a population's growth or development from a health perspective without taking into consideration mental health. I should say from the outset that I am an international development specialist. I spent 10 years, as I said, working in humanitarian assistance as a project manager for MSF, but I'm not a mental health practitioner. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a medical person. So my experience really comes from working in projects overseas where mental health was a large component of our health response, and then in looking at issues of mental health from a development perspective. But I wanted to put out that caveat there in honor to be truly transparent from the beginning. So let's think first about what we mean by health. We talk a lot about health around the world and how different countries are faring in terms of reaching the MDGs related to health. But what is health? So from the World Health Organization, or the WHO, we have this definition. Good health is a state of complete physical, social, and mental well-being, and is not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. But I would argue that this last piece, the absence of disease or infirmity, tends to be what gets the attention. As I said, this is really what we tend to jump to when we're evaluating health outcomes in different countries. Meanwhile, health is, of course, a fundamental human right that's recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And health is recognized as an essential component of development. We know that it's vital to a nation's economic growth, to its social growth, and to a community's well-being overall. We know that better health outcomes have a direct impact in reducing poverty and in helping communities rise up from poverty. However, as I say, I think that mental health is often missing from this picture. So how do we measure growth and development vis-a-vis health? As I said, we typically tend to jump to things like mortality and life expectancy when we're thinking about health. So in preparation for this presentation, I was looking at some of the World Health statistics. And every year we publish these long analysis of how are various countries doing in relation to others and in relation to how they were in the previous years. And there's absolutely no reference to mental health in any of these key statistics. There will occasionally be a reference to communities' access to essential health services like water and sanitation, public health facilities, things like numbers of doctors and nurses per population numbers, but there is literally no mention of health in any of these key statistics. This is not to say that morbidity and mortality are not really important tools. Coming from a humanitarian assistance background, I recognize that there are critical health needs that need to be measured and addressed. But I really think that mental health is absolutely tied to a community's ability to flourish and to function, and we need to talk about this more. I would also argue that putting a stronger emphasis on mental health is important in terms of humanitarian assistance, but also in terms of longer-term development projects that have a health focus. So while I'll speak a lot today from my own experience working with MSF, which of course is coming from a humanitarian assistance angle, I think many, if not all of these same points can be applied to longer-term development goals as well. So we've talked about health and the definition of health. What does the WHO have to say about mental health? So mental health here is defined as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So in this definition, we can see how mental health is really central to individual and community development. And when I think about MSF's mandate, the mandate of MSF is to alleviate suffering, to provide first-line assistance in emergencies, but also to help restore dignity to the populations in which it's working. And to me, this definition of mental health really speaks to that. And I was not able to be here this morning because my 5-week-old wouldn't allow it. But I know that there was a lot of talk around, how do we measure growth? And how do we measure development at a community level? And here, we can see clearly how important mental health is to individuals and communities being able to cope and to prosper. So I've seen many times working in the field with MSF that within a community, we're tending to their primary health needs. So this might be in a post-conflict or a conflict area where we're treating most of the normal morbidities, diarrhea, malaria, the big upper respiratory tract infections, the big diseases that we see in emergencies. Often we're also treating trauma, war wounded, or in the case of a natural disaster, an earthquake or a tsunami, we're treating injuries related to that. But once the frontline healthcare is completed or is ongoing, you can see that communities are still lacking essential help to actually grow and to recover. And you see that manifested in a lot of sort of strange ways. We see patients complaining of sort of vague health complaints that you can't put your finger on. We see insomnia, anxiety, depression. We see mothers and fathers who are struggling to care for their children. You see sort of a real sense of hopelessness and an apathy about the future, which directly relates to a community's ability to start working again, to start rebuilding their homes, to start rebuilding their communities. And that set of health needs really needs to be addressed as well as the sort of urgent frontline medical needs. And this is not a small group of people that we're talking about in the world. So a few statistics. About 450 million people globally suffer from a mental health condition, and the majority of them live in a low-income country. And to be clear, when I'm talking about mental health conditions, we are talking about mental illnesses, things like schizophrenia and illnesses that often need medical treatment. But I'm also here talking about people who have a mental problem that they're suffering as a result of conflict or an experience that they've had. So some of the things that I described, depression, anxiety, and then of course things like post-traumatic stress syndrome that might be directly related to an event that they've suffered. So 85% of people with mental health disabilities who do live in the developing world have absolutely no access to any kind of services. So this is a huge number of people. And around 20% of the world's children and adolescents have a mental health disorder or a problem. And most of them live in a region of the world where they have almost no access to any services at all. So in the countries where most of these children live, there's often less than, for example, one child psychologist for every 1 million to 4 million people. So we're talking about really a total paucity of services. And again, working with MSF, we see in many countries where we've worked, we try to work with the Ministry of Health as much as possible. But in countries like DRC, in Uganda, where I've worked, the Ministry of Health is barely functioning even to provide very basic primary health care services in many, especially more conflict-affected or far-flung regions of the countries. So then to put in place mental health specialists is even more of a challenge. So the WHO and other organizations recognize that mental health is one of the most neglected development issues in achieving the MDGs, and Heather spoke to that, and I won't go into the ones that are directly related to mental health, but I think we can make some guesses there. Maternal mortality, education rates, all of this is related, of course, to people's mental health as well. So we know that poor mental health is both a cause and a consequence of poverty. Speaking briefly about integrating mental health into emergency response programming, we know that in emergencies, rates of mental health disorders tend to double. So then imagine countries where people are living in a virtual constant state of emergency. Thinking about a country like Colombia that has one of the highest rates of internally displaced people in the world. Or again, thinking about the Democratic Republic of Congo, where people are literally fleeing from front line to front line, displaced time and time again. They're living in essentially an acute emergency. So the mental health issues are extreme. People with mental health problems are especially vulnerable in times of disaster or in conflict. They may be reliant on services that then are no longer there for them if they have to move or have to change locations. People with mental health problems having mental health problems can worsen physical health problems that they may have as well. So we can talk about comorbidities. We know that mental health problems make it more difficult for people to stick to their treatment regimens, for example, especially people who are on long-term treatment regimens for diseases like TB or HIV/AIDS. Mental health problems also affect the whole family. And if we think about the economic development side of things, I've spoken mostly about the human impact of mental health problems. But of course there is an economic side to all of this as well. If someone in your family is suffering from a mental health disorder, they're unable to contribute perhaps economically to the family, but the whole family might be involved in trying to care for them and may also have limited resources for those reasons. We also know that mental health conditions can stunt social and economic development and recovery after crisis. So if a community has been badly affected by a natural disaster or by a conflict, their resources, their resilience is also compromised when there are unaddressed mental health problems. This also adversely affects the prospects for conflict resolution and peace building after a conflict. So I do want to talk just really briefly about MSF's approach, and this is not an approach that's unique to MSF. There are lots of other organizations that use a similar approach, but MSF's approach I think is one that can be applied to both humanitarian assistance and to development. So with this approach, it's a very simple approach where the emphasis is really on improving coping skills and reducing symptoms. So it's about increasing the resilience of a person or a community and helping them to manage the stresses in their life. And what I found amazing when I was working in projects that were addressing mental health needs was that a pretty significant impact can be made within 2 or 3 interventions. So when I was working in Aceh in Indonesia after the tsunami, we found that for people who were suffering as a direct consequence of that experience, within 2 or 3 sessions, either in group therapy or in individual therapy, their symptoms were dramatically improved. So we have teams right now heading to Nepal to offer those same services. I'm going to run out of time, but I just really want to make the point that this type of model that MSF uses is integrated into the public health regime in a country as well. So we would have frontline workers in a public health center who would be trying to identify people who were coming up with generalized anxiety or unexplained illnesses and referring them to mental health services. But also this broad and sort of comprehensive approach involves health education. It involves training lay people to do individual and group counseling sessions, and really can have a very fast impact in a very short period of time. So I know I'm out of time. I had a couple more points to make about integrating mental health services into public health programming, but I think that, that the arguments that I just made can be extended to that as well. And I'm going to just take 30 more seconds, I'm going to cheat, and just talk very quickly about some of the barriers that I see. First of all, mental health is often not seen as a development priority or as part of the key public health agenda. The big killer diseases eclipse the importance of mental health, as they should in some ways, but we need to keep this on the agenda. Funding is very difficult. You can't package up a nice commercial of someone who's suffering from mental health and sell that to donors as easily as you can in different, more standard diseases. The current setup of mental health services and the lack of integration within primary health care is a big problem, specifically related to inadequate human resources that exist in most countries. So I would encourage all of you to just keep mental health on the tip of your brains when you're thinking about health development generally. And I hope that in the years to come there can be more leadership around this issue and that we can make some strides in improving the treatment of mental health. That's it.
Asha, that was great. Oh, please, that was perfect. Thank you. That was a very good presentation. We have time for a few questions, even though, we seem to rush. We're not. So, questions? Yes. Aye.
Yes, thank you for that. This may actually make the problem even more pronounced, I suppose, because mental health is so stigmatized and there are so many areas where there are limited resources in relation to that. How is mental health as a problem identified? So how do you quantify I think you said 450 million people. Is it in fact 450 million people, or is it a billion people because you don't have the resources to actually identify the problems? And then, what do you do actually after you've identified that there may in fact be a bigger problem than you think in the first place?
You're right. I'm sure that it's much, much bigger than that because it's difficult to identify mental health problems, and many cultures don't recognize them. We were doing mental health interventions for people who had suffered through the tsunami, but also we were working in the area of Indonesia and the area of Aceh that had been affected by a conflict for a long time. And as we were doing health education around mental health issues, that was the first step. This was a group of people who didn't really have a concept of mental health as such. So that was the first step, was just doing that education before we could even identify who then needed treatment. And then that brings with it all the cultural challenges as well of not wanting to impose sort of a Western vision of mental health problems on a group of people who might have totally different coping mechanisms. But that's exactly it. And that's again why I think embedding mental health services as much as possible within primary health care is important to reduce stigma so that people can access care without having to go to the special mental health place, as well as just doing education around what you're feeling is actually maybe connected to this, and there are things that we can offer to make you feel better.
Thank you, and I think we don't have mental health well in hand here either.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your presentation. It was great. And I fully appreciate that MSF typically works with populations in crisis. But my first exposure to mental health in this context actually occurred last summer when I was in Uganda. And we were working with an organization called Rotom that services seniors in Uganda, a really, really underserved population. And one of the issues that was shared with me was the concern that the next generation of Ugandans are all being raised depressed because they're being raised by grandparents, primarily grandmothers. And the national statistics indicate that every grandmother is raising at least 3 grandchildren on average. And these grandparents have no resources. They have no money, they have no food, they have no social safety net. And they're still mourning the deaths of their own adult children from HIV, AIDS, and other causes. And now they've got to raise another generation. And I think, 20 years from now when I'm a grandparent, if I had to raise 3 or 4 grandchildren, that's a pretty hard task when you're that age. Yeah. And then imagine if you don't have any resources and you can't send these kids to school. This all of a sudden became a huge issue for me. I mean, it's huge, absolutely huge. Yeah. That's a huge proportion of the population. Yeah. And how do we deal with that more as a chronic problem than an acute problem?
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought up Uganda because I was there in 2003 and we were doing a lot of work because the conflict was in full tilt then. We were doing a lot of work with children who had been child soldiers and sort of the more acute thing that you were talking about. But I was happy to read that one of the WHO sort of success stories in terms of normalizing mental health care in public health system was Uganda. But they've been working on their their mental health policy since 2000 and are just barely scratch the surface in terms of actually rolling it out. So the services are not there. And with regards to the grandparents, what comes to mind as well is one of the organizations that works on mental health has a great chart that I wasn't able to replicate. But if you can imagine a triangle or a pyramid, when we think often about mental health, people think about drugs and treatment and the people who suffer from illnesses like schizophrenia. Really, that focus is the very tip of the triangle. At the bottom, where most of our energy needs to be directed, is on advocating for services for people like these grandparents. And you can't start thinking about your mental health status while you don't have a place to live, while you don't have money to buy food. Of course, all that work needs to be done first. And then in between are various layers of community awareness raising, making sure that in the primary healthcare system there are people who are trained up, and then the very tip is actually treating people with medications. So I liked that sort of graphic of this continuum of sort of where our energies should be going in order to meet the needs of the most people, and sort of best bang for your buck.
Interestingly, the most funding that's coming for that particular organization that's servicing the seniors is from Canada through the Stephen Lewis.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, great. And actually, Grand Challenges Canada has done some very innovative funding of organizations that are doing cool stuff with, in Pakistan using text message and online technologies. So if you have a chance and you want to learn more, go to the Grand Challenges website. And over the last 5 years, every year they funded some very cool, innovative mental health programs.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So our last speaker for today is Sarat Chandra Ciccotti. I said it right. And Sarat is currently a faculty member of the Humber College International Development Degree Program. He is a sociologist by training and a social development specialist in practice. He possesses over 15 years of teaching experience at both undergraduate and graduate levels in 4 Canadian universities, at home and abroad. Sarat has also worked in Sri Lanka as a social work educator, in the Philippines as a development communicator, in Nepal as the Canadian project manager for a SIDA health development project, in Nunavut, Canada as a community wellness director, and in Prince Edward Island as the provincial director for Health Canada. Sarat's landmark projects in the above countries include community rehabilitation of the disabled in Sri Lanka, community wellness center in Nunavut, women's empowerment through literacy in Nepal, and coordination of health services information, intelligence, and gender-based analysis in PEI Canada. Sarat has published over 10 research articles, and his latest publication will be entitled Untold Stories of Development. Sarat, thank you so much for joining us today.
What I'm going to talk about in general is a theme running like a thread in all of the issues that we have been listening to, we have been grappling with in the morning. What is the role of the culture? Does it become an obstacle, or it becomes a facilitator for development? And with special reference to health, the culture is affecting everything that we do. We all are products of a certain kind of culture, whether it's Canadian or it's Jamaican, whether it's Sri Lankan, Indian. We have lived with a certain culture, and then we cross boundaries and acquire new qualities of cultures. So I'm going to give you some examples from my own experience, and they are not the ideal examples, they are not the best examples, but I thought, for this kind of presentation, that's what I could bring. Now, where does these examples come from? Based on some of my own experience in 3 countries. The National Institute of Social Development, Colombo, Sri Lanka, I was the deputy director and the director of that institute before I left for Canada. And that was the institution, the only institution in Sri Lanka which produces social workers, the professional social workers. So I had this wonderful administrative experience plus a lot of field experience in all the remote rural areas in Sri Lanka. And then I got this opportunity to work for SIDA between 1996 and 98. They sent me to Nepal to work in Surkhet district, which is 400 miles west of Kathmandu, and managing a Canadian health development project. So that's a fascinating experience. I went with certain kinds of assumptions, and all have been destroyed within the first 3 months. And then I had to start reconfiguring the project, based on the field experience. When I came back, and I had this privilege of working with the Inuit people in the Canadian North, in Cambridge Bay first, and then in Iqaluit in Nunavut. So that was another set of experiences. And then finally, federal government again gave me a job to work in Prince Edward Island as the Health Canada, the provincial director. Although that was 50% administrative, bureaucratic, the other 50% I made myself a kind of a social worker and a field worker. I went through the island and tried to learn and help the islanders in a number of different ways. Well, the first question that comes to your mind and my mind, if you are going to talk about culture, now how do you define culture? Now this is my definition of culture. I came across 3,700 definitions of culture in the literature, but this is how I see it. It's a system of values and norms. Values are the most crucial thing in culture. It does not change the way that we want them. Sometimes they change suddenly. And the language, the beliefs, practices, worldview, all of those things, are part of the culture. And the language has a very strong component in the cultural analysis. And the other thing, the mistake that a lot of people do is they think that the culture is in your blood. All the world wars going on even today, both parties, the opponents and the proponents, they tend to think that I have this particular special kind of blood, and if that is the case, we can only have 4 cultures in the world, the A, B, and O. But we have over 3,700, 3,700 cultures in the world. So the culture is the factor behind, not the blood connection that you have. Culture is learned. We all learn culture from our parents and the grandparents and systems in place. It is shared. We tend to, if you take 10 people from the same culture, you would see a lot of commonalities, and it's transmitted from generation to generation. Now, those are important considerations when we talked about health. And it's not a static thing that does not change. It's a very dynamic force. And we know that my 24 years in Canada, when I first came here, majority of Canadians were smoking. Now it's very difficult to find somebody smoke today. That was a radical change in the behaviors of Canadians. So it is a dynamic force. And created before you were born, the culture that I grew up with, several cultures that I had to sort of pass through in my life. And it was created before I was born, and after my death someday, I'm sure the culture is going to continue. So it's external to me, external to all of us, but it continues to influence all of us all the time. Of course, there are cultural stereotypes. I came across many of those. One particular in Nepal, based on the religious prescriptions, the women are being considered impure. They cannot think. They cannot be creative. Therefore, they deserve a very low status in the culture. Now, that has been given to them, especially unfortunately by men who wrote some books like The Laws of Manu, the Laws of Manu, the Manusmriti, in a kind of literature, and have been going on for a long period of time, the stereotypes. And it's a distinctive traits of human groups, and the cultural produces meanings through interaction. That's what the Stuart Hall produced, in his literature. And culture makes who you are. It's very difficult to find somebody who does not have a culture. The very fact that you say, I don't have a culture, means that is your culture. So it sort of embraces you whether you like it or not. Well, and I don't need to go through all of those. The third and fourth development, the UN definitions change about the development, and we brought the people first. Now, when you bring people first into development, you're actually bringing the culture at the same time. The culture is a resource for establishing an identity, who you are. At the same time, it helps you to sort of deal with some of the negative impact of modernization. Now, we talked about human happiness today, and I would consider the human happiness is, the mental health is part of the human happiness, which I realized in Nepal when I was working there. Now, the question we have is culture a facilitator or an obstacle for development? Culture is a dynamic force I mentioned earlier, and it changes through the diffusion, discovery, or invention. When I was climbing mountains in Nepal, it was very difficult to find a bottle of water, but I could very easily find Sprite and Coke. Now, that shows how the invasion, the definition of Western items going into rural areas like Nepal. Well, I don't need to again talk about the definition of health. It's not just the absence of illness, but it's the total, the comprehensive understanding and the status of people's well-being. And it's not something that begins and ends with oneself. The way that we look at health is a collective effort. I could see that very clearly in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, even in Nunavut and in Prince Edward Island. If you define health as a collective effort, you would see the better results. So some of the examples that I want to bring you is the literacy among Nepali women. Now, I was given by SIDA nicely crafted, very well printed, colorful brochures, handouts to take to the community. I went with them and to realize that the Nepali women, most of them in Surkha district, 280,000 people, they could not read and write. Now, what am I going to do with the $5 million that the SIDA is giving us, when these people cannot read and write? So we started classes, teaching their own language. The immediate impact of that was, they went home after 6 months, they started sending their daughters to school. In that particular region of Nepal, daughters are not supposed to go to school. They are supposed to just stay home, get married, at a very early age, produce children and look after the home and husband. That's the kind of a prevailing cultural expectations. The mothers, the women challenged that particular cultural expectation, and we had to now deal with the increased participation of young girls in school system. That was a fascinating change. I mean, thanks to SIDA money that we were able to do some of those things. Violence against Nepali women, that was again coming from a patriarchal kind of framework. Very easily a man could hit the wife. Many young women were beaten up by their husbands when they came to these night classes. The argument was, why are you trying to learn things? Because your role is supposed to be very domestic. You are not going to work. Now, those are some of the cultural challenges that we had to work with. Now, the other most saddest thing was a lot of women, are not allowed inside the house during their menstruation period. They have built those outhouses, and I had this very good interesting dialogue with my own accountant. One day he mentioned this, he said, well, for everything else, your wife is the wonderful person, but how come that this is not a sickness that she is having? This is a very normal procedure, so we had to have this dialogue all the time. And now the other one was how to bring up the healthy son. Now the son, having a son is a primary requirement of the Hindu in the Hindu culture in Nepal. So we were trying to explore that. How do you bring up a healthy son? And we realized, of course, my team realized that most of the things that we would give to a pregnant woman in Canada are not given. Eggs are polluted, it's a symbol of impure treatment, and no meat, any of those protein and the vitamins kind of thing are prohibited during the time of pregnancy. Now, who controls these things? This is primarily the mother-in-law's control. So we have to work with not just the pregnant women, we have to work with the whole community in bringing their changes, and changing the way that they think. The snake bites, and we equipped the hospital. There's only one hospital in the region, and with anti-venom, the injections. And however, still the young girls were dying after beaten up by the cobras, the snakes. And what happens is when a cobra, bites a young person or an older person, they spend about an hour performing a ritual. And as a sociologist, as a Canadian going into this field, I was not going to challenge that particular set of beliefs. But I told them, that's perfectly all right, but why don't you take the patient to the hospital first, bring the person back, and then do your ritual so that we can save the child or the person. There had been many, many instances like that. And the meeting deadlines, unfortunately, it's a very interesting cultural expectation. The SIDA has given me a lot of deadlines. You have to meet all of those every other week. But in that particular culture, based on the religious prescriptions, if you cannot finish something this birth, you can do it in the next birth. Now that is a real cultural issue that you have to face as a development worker. Canadian note, the chronic diseases management and the Aboriginal people, the Mohawk experiment, something that I would like to point out. We have noticed, based on the most recent, the Western influence on the northern communities, the diabetes, the blood pressure, the cholesterol problems, all of those things were, increasing at a rate. I remember the Mohawk, I listened to one of the presentations. The young people of Mohawk descent, they came to the Canadian university, got their degrees, went back and sort of stirred up the whole community. The whole community was jogging, they were walking, getting into very healthy lifestyles at one time. And of course, unfortunately, the problems in the north, the high drinking levels, spousal abuse, and all of those that we see today were not in the original Inuit culture. But these things were introduced later on due to various political influences. And so the rapid change, they are still trying to deal with that change. Well, Prince Edward Island, one of the examples I think I will give you. When I got the job, I went around the island, which is, can be covered in 3 hours, small island. And I talked to some of the families, and we had a big problem in Prince Edward Island at that time. I'm talking about 2002. We didn't have enough doctors. Now, you cannot bring doctors from Toronto because they find it not challenging enough to work in Charlottetown. We went and talked to the families, and I talked to the parents and said, you have these young children, why don't you send them to the medical school? They are in the right age. Some of the things that they told me was, well, we have no problem with, my daughter becoming a doctor, but what happens, we don't have a medical school. They will go to Toronto, they will find somebody from Vancouver, they will never come back to PEI. We are losing our daughter. Now, that is a real interesting cultural, factor that, we had to deal with. So you had to replace that kind of thinking with, well, how about having a wonderful daughter who will work in your own community? So just change some of these equations in that. And of course, one of the issues that's coming up now is the immigrant women asking for female doctors, and PEI does not have enough female doctors. And the last one, I will bring from my own country where I was born and spent my 24 years. The disability comes with a stigma. Even if you do treatments, and especially when it comes to mental health, they do not think that the person has been cured. They still tend to think that no, this person is eternally mentally ill. The physical disability. The project that we were introducing was through the World Health Organization. How to train disabled persons at home, training somebody in the family who can look after them and then train them, giving them the basic skills. So those are all culture-bound problems. And then the last thing that I think I have 1 more minute is the critical issue when it comes to culture is the clashes between the cultural expectations of human rights and the universal human rights. I think we mentioned about that earlier about the genital mutilation in some cultures is a prescription, it's required, whereas when you go out of that context, it is a kind of a crime. Now, those clashes that we run into all these. In Nepal, the men generally thought that the women have to be punished when they do not follow their instructions. Now, that's a very big cultural conflict. The way that we look at it is a kind of family violence. So I think that is a thing that we need to deal with. And the conclusion is that the cultural diversity and human rights must coexist, not compete with each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have time for 1 or maybe 2 because we're getting signals from the door. Questions? Very, very amazing presentation, and the practice of Chhaupadi in Nepal is, we have experience with that too, and how a very brief story there, a mentor of mine in Nepal introduced a project in a village that practices Chhaupadi, so when they ban girls to animal sheds during their menstruation. And they introduced this culturally insensitive project, and at the end of it, instead of things getting better, they actually built a pathway for the girls to use during their menstruation. So not only did it get worse, but they started to build separate pathways for them to walk on. So always lessons in development to be culturally sensitive. And thank you very much for your presentation.